5 true scary stories of dark family secrets you won't believe. The house stood like an old sentinel at the edge of the sleepy town, its frames sagging under the weight of years, yet still holding a certain sense of grandeur. It had always been there, a constant in my life, a place where time seemed to move differently, slower, almost as if it was stuck in a forgotten era. I hadn't visited in years, but something had drawn me back. The pull of a place so deeply tied to my past, a place I once called home. It was strange to stand before it now, with the memories of my childhood swirling around me like the thick fog that clung to the ground in the early mornings. The air smelled different, damp, heavy with the scent of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic, like the lingering trace of blood. The old front door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty house, reminding me that no one had lived here for quite some time. The floors groaned beneath my feet, and every room seemed to whisper its own secrets, carrying with it a faint undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. The house had always felt like a part of me, but now, as I stood in the entryway, it felt alien, as if it no longer welcomed me. I wandered through the rooms, tracing my fingers along the dusty furniture, the same furniture that had been there when I was a child. My parents' portraits hung on the walls, their faces frozen in time. But even their familiar gazes seemed different now, distant, cold, as if they were aware of something I wasn't. The house had changed, but it wasn't just the peeling wallpaper or the faded carpets. There was something off about it. The air felt thicker, heavier. I heard a faint sound from upstairs, something soft, like a whisper or a footstep. But when I turned, there was no one there. My heart quickened, and I found myself drawn to the staircase, my mind pulling me in a direction I couldn't fully understand. As I ascended, the house seemed to close in around me. The old attic door beckoned from the end of the hallway, its brass handle tarnished and worn. I hesitated for a moment, uncertainty swirling in my stomach, but curiosity won out. The attic had always been a place of mystery, a room full of forgotten things and half-remembered stories. I had spent hours as a child sifting through the boxes up there, uncovering relics from the past, but there was always one corner I avoided, one place that seemed too dark, too silent. Today, the attic felt different, almost alive, as though it had been waiting for me. I reached for the door, and as I pulled it open, the stale air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of old paper and dust. The light was dim, the only illumination coming from the single, flickering bulb overhead. I stepped inside, my footfall echoing on the wooden floorboards, and my eyes immediately landed on something unexpected. A leather-bound journal lay atop a dusty pile of old family photographs and keepsakes. It looked ancient, its edges frayed and its pages yellowed with age. My hand trembled as I reached for it, the weight of the journal heavier than it should have been. It was almost as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to open it. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the familiar handwriting of my grandfather, who had been the patriarch of the family. At first, it seemed like ordinary family records, birth dates, anniversaries, mundane details about everyday life. But then I noticed something strange. The entries grew more erratic, more frantic, as if my grandfather had begun to unravel. The ink seemed darker, the words more cryptic. There were mentions of a secret, something buried, something forgotten by everyone but him. Why must we hide the truth? One entry read, "It will never stay hidden forever. It will find its way back." My heart skipped a beat. There it was, something lurking just beneath the surface of the ordinary, something I had not expected. The journal, once a simple family record, now felt like a map to something far darker. The whispers that had haunted me in the house grew louder in my ears, a chorus of voices, calling out from the past, urging me to uncover the truth. I set the journal down and looked around the attic. It was as if the very walls were watching me, waiting for me to piece it all together. The floor creaked under my weight, and I felt a chill that wasn't from the old house settling deep in my bones. Something was wrong. The house was more than just a home. It was a trap, a prison, a keeper of secrets. I couldn't shake the feeling that the journal was just the beginning. There were stories buried here, stories that had been locked away for far too long. And as I turned to leave the attic, a new realization struck me. Whatever secrets this house held, they weren't just about the past. They were tied to me, to my family, to my very blood. I was not just a witness, I was a part of it. And as I closed the attic door behind me, I knew one thing for certain. I was about to uncover something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. The stories of old were about to come to life, and I was ready, or at least I thought I was. The journal had shown me the way, but the path ahead was dark, and there would be no turning back. Story 1. The Silent Witness. I remember the house in ways that are sharp and jagged, pieces of memories slipping through the cracks of time like sand between fingers. It wasn't the house I grew up in, not really, but it was where my family stayed. The same house that bore witness to something unspeakable, something I couldn't understand. I was too young then, too innocent to know what it all meant, but the shadows of that day still cling to me, even now. I was only 8 years old when it happened. The thing I saw, the thing that twisted my childhood into a nightmare. It was late, far past my bedtime, but I had woken up thirsty. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I padded down the hallway. The familiar sound soothing, a reminder of home. But when I reached the stairs that led into the living room, the sound of my father's voice stopped me dead in my tracks. It was different, low, tense like a thread pulled taut about to snap. I peered around the corner. The kitchen light was on, but the living room was shadowed, except for the faint glow of the fireplace. My father was there, standing in front of my mother. His face was pale, his lips trembling slightly as he spoke to her, but it was his hands that scared me. They were gripping something tightly, something that glinted in the dim light. I couldn't see it clearly, but it didn't matter. The look in his eyes, the look I had never seen before, told me everything. He wasn't just my father in that moment. He was something else, someone capable of something dark. The words they exchanged were muffled, like the air between us had thickened, drowning out their conversation. I wanted to run, to scream for help, but I couldn't. I was frozen, rooted to the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. And then the unmistakable sound of a struggle broke through the haze, the scraping of something sharp against flesh, the sudden sharp breath from my mother, and then silence. The air seemed to shudder with tension as my father stood there, looking down at the ground. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't understand what had just happened, what I had just witnessed. And then it was over just as quickly as it had begun. That night, I slept with the blanket pulled tightly over my head, the image of my father standing over my mother, something twisted in his grip, burning itself into my mind. But when I woke up the next morning, nothing was different. My mother smiled at me like nothing had happened. My father acted like his usual self, though there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. I couldn't place it, but it was there, a heaviness that lingered in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. For weeks, I stayed quiet, not daring to say a word. It was easier to pretend it had never happened, easier to bury it deep down where I couldn't touch it, couldn't bring it to light. But it wasn't easy. It never was. My father's eyes, whenever he looked at me, were different, cold, calculating, as if he knew that I knew something. And every night, after the lights went out and the house fell silent, I would hear the whispers. Faint at first, like a voice too soft to be real. But as the days went on, they grew louder, clearer. They spoke in riddles, urging me to stay silent, to never speak, to forget what I had seen. The shadows in the corners of my room grew darker, their shapes twisting and shifting as if they were alive, as if they too knew what I had witnessed. I told myself it was just my imagination. I tried to dismiss it, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The house was changing, warping, becoming something I didn't recognize. And it wasn't just the house. It was me too. I felt as if I were becoming something else, something wrong with each passing day. Years passed, and the whispers faded, but the fear never did. I grew up, tried to move on, tried to forget. My father never spoke of that night, and neither did I. My mother acted like it was a bad dream, something that had never really happened. And yet every time I looked at my father, I saw that same coldness in his eyes, that same darkness. I grew older, and with age came an understanding of what I had witnessed, a crime. But I had stayed silent, and by staying silent, I had become complicit. I had helped bury the truth, even if I hadn't meant to. That realization hit me like a thunderclap, but it was too late. My silence had bound me to the crime in a way I couldn't escape. I returned to the house, now an adult, and as I walked through the rooms I had once known so well, it felt like stepping into a tomb. The walls seemed to breathe, the air thick with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. I wandered through the halls, haunted by the memories of what I had seen, the faces of my family that no longer seemed familiar. And then, in the corner of the living room, I saw it, my father's old chair, still in the same spot where he had always sat. It looked so normal, so ordinary, yet I couldn't bring myself to sit in it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind there, something that would never be erased. I walked upstairs to the room I had once slept in, the same room where I had hidden from the darkness. The air felt colder now, the shadows deeper. And then I heard it again, the whispering. It was coming from the walls, a low murmur, like a voice calling my name. I knew what it was, knew who it was. It was my father's voice, but distorted, warped by guilt and years of secrets. The house was alive with the weight of all that had been hidden, all that had been ignored. I had tried to run from it, tried to bury the past, but it had followed me. It always does. I stood there, in the silence of the house, realizing that I could never truly escape. The truth was too big, too dark, and I had carried it with me all these years. I had never been just an innocent bystander. I had played a part in keeping the secret. I had chosen silence, and in doing so, I had sealed my own fate. As I left the house for the last time, I felt a chill settle deep in my bones. The whispers were gone, but the weight of what I had done, the guilt, the complicity, remained. And somewhere, deep within the house, I knew that the past would never truly be buried. It would always live on, in the walls, in the shadows, and in the silence. And now it lived in me too. I had been a silent witness, but I was no longer silent. The truth had found its way to the surface, and it was more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. Story 2. The Family Curse. There is an old saying that echoes through my family like a ghost haunting the halls of our ancestral home. The sins of the father are passed down through the generations. Growing up, I heard it whispered by my grandmother, spoken with an air of quiet dread. It was more than just a saying, more than just a warning. It was a truth woven into the very fabric of our family history. Each generation, it seemed, was doomed to repeat the same tragic fates, falling victim to the same dark cloud of misfortune that hung over us. The stories of death, loss, and failure have always lingered in the background of our family gatherings, a silent presence at every wedding, birthday, and holiday dinner. From the sudden death of my great-grandfather to my uncle's inexplicable disappearance, to the financial ruin that befell my parents despite their seemingly perfect lives, it was clear something was terribly wrong with us. The curse, the family curse, was real. No one ever dared to speak of it outright, at least not openly, but it was there like a weight pressing down on our every move, our every choice. And no matter how far we ran from it, no matter how much we tried to escape, we always seemed to circle back to the same dark fate. I never believed in curses. Not really. But after everything that happened, after everything I'd witnessed in my own short life, I wasn't so sure anymore. I decided to investigate, to uncover the truth that had been buried for generations. Perhaps I could finally understand what was behind this string of endless calamities, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to break the cycle. I started with the records, old family journals, handwritten letters, documents passed down like sacred relics. Most of them were vague, cryptic even, as if the family knew something they didn't want to be remembered. But amidst the haphazard piles of papers, I found something that chilled me to my core. A journal entry written by my great-great-grandfather, dated exactly 100 years ago. The ink was faded, the handwriting shaky, but the words were unmistakable. I have made a pact. The price is steep, but I am desperate. Wealth, power, influence, all at my fingertips. The price for this power is the blood of my kin, their souls bound to the bargain. But it will be worth it. The wealth and security I can provide my family will be more than enough to repay the price. The words were shocking, but they were also clear. It was a bargain, a deal with something dark, something unnatural. A deal made in exchange for power, for wealth, for everything that the family could never quite reach on their own. But the price, as it always is with such bargains, was steep, too steep. The curse wasn't just about death, as I'd assumed. It was about the moral decay, the crumbling of every generation that came after. Each one making the same selfish choices, cutting the same bloody deals to preserve their status, their wealth, their lives. It was a curse not of supernatural origins, but one born of human greed, pride, and betrayal. I traveled to the places where my ancestors had lived, hoping the land would hold secrets that their records could not. I visited the crumbling old estate where my great-great-grandfather had made his fateful pact, the very same house where my grandmother had grown up. The place was empty now, abandoned to the ravages of time, but even in its decay, it felt like a prison. The air was thick, heavy with the memories of all those who had lived and died there. I could almost hear the whispers of their regrets. In the deepest part of the house, in the cellar that no one had dared to enter for decades, I found an old, rotting chest. Inside was a collection of items, strange artifacts, dusty books, and symbols I couldn't begin to understand. Among them was a letter, written in a language that was foreign to me, but whose meaning was clear. It was an offer, a deal made with something darker than any mortal man could comprehend. The words on the paper were a binding contract, and in it, the price had already been paid. Each generation was marked, bound by the choices of the past, doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over. I began to understand. The curse wasn't just about death. It wasn't just about tragedy. It was about choices, the choices we make, the choices my family had made over and over again. My great-great-grandfather's betrayal had set the tone for everything that came after. His greed had cursed us all, and each generation had been too afraid, too prideful to break free from the chains he had bound us with. But I wasn't afraid, or at least I didn't want to be. I sat in the darkened room of the old house, holding the letter in my hands, my heart racing. The power to end the curse was within my reach. The answers were clear. I could confront the truth, I could break the cycle, and I could free my family from this dark legacy. But the question that lingered, the question that haunted me, was whether I had the strength to do it. Would I be able to turn my back on the wealth, the power, the legacy that had been built upon a foundation of darkness? Could I break the curse and finally free my family? Or would I be tempted to preserve what we had, to keep the riches and security we'd always craved? Would I, like so many before me, succumb to the same greed that had doomed them all? As I sat there, the weight of history pressing down on me, I realized that I could never truly escape what had been done. The past would always be a part of me. The question then was not whether I could break the curse, but whether I would. In the end, I chose to face the darkness head-on, to confront the sins of my ancestors and release my family from the weight of their moral failures. I took the letter, the pact, and I burned it. I destroyed the symbols, erased the contract, and in doing so, I severed the link that had bound us to that malevolent force. It was a decision that cost me everything, the wealth, the power, the security, but it was also the only way to stop the cycle, to stop the curse. But as the flames consumed the last of the letter, I felt the weight of history lift from my shoulders. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Free from the past, free from the darkness that had followed my family for generations. The cycle was broken. The curse was lifted. And though I would never forget what had been done, I knew that the future was mine to shape. Story 3. Whispers in the Walls. When we first saw the house, we thought it was perfect. The kind of home you dream about when you imagine starting a life together. Quiet, nestled at the edge of a small town, surrounded by trees that swayed like old sentinels in the breeze. It had charm, an old farmhouse with a history. The price was right too, and after months of searching, we were eager to settle in. It seemed like a fresh start, a new chapter in our lives. But the house, old as it was, had a history far older than we could have known. At first, the oddities were small enough to ignore. Creaky floorboards, the scent of dust that wouldn't quite dissipate no matter how much we cleaned, the chill in the air that never quite seemed to leave. We chalked it up to the house settling, the way older houses sometimes feel like they're breathing, as if they carry memories in their very bones. Then at night, the whispers began. At first, it was just a faint murmuring, something I might have imagined after a long day of moving boxes and arranging furniture. Maybe it's just the wind, I suggested to my wife, Ellie, when she remarked on it. But it didn't sound like the wind. It was too deliberate, too distinct, as if someone was whispering just out of reach, just behind the walls. I laughed it off, thinking it might be the house settling, some old plumbing or beams expanding in the cold. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder. Faint, hushed voices, echoing in the dead of night, always calling names I didn't recognize. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the morning, I could hear them clearly through the walls, faint but distinct, like muffled conversations just out of earshot. Names, words I couldn't place. It was unsettling, to say the least. But Ellie was the practical one. She thought I was letting my imagination run wild. Old houses do strange things, she told me, trying to reassure me. Let's give it time. But there was something about those voices that gnawed at me. They felt too real, too insistent. One night, after a long stretch of silence, I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when the whispers came again. This time, they weren't just background noise. They were sharper, clearer. Margaret, Margaret, come home. I turned to Ellie, who was sound asleep beside me, oblivious. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice hoarse in the darkness. She stirred but didn't wake, and the whispers continued, relentless. This time, the name they called was different. A woman's name, one I hadn't heard before, Margaret. The whispers repeated the name over and over again, with a desperation I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I decided to explore. I wasn't sure what I was searching for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was trying to tell me something. I started in the attic, poking around in old boxes filled with forgotten relics of the past. There was nothing remarkable at first, just old furniture, newspapers, and a few dusty paintings. But as I dug deeper into the far corner, I found something that chilled me to my core. A family portrait, the faces of a man, woman, and child staring out at me. The woman looked familiar. Her face was striking, her eyes intense, as if she were staring straight through me. I turned the frame over, and there it was scribbled in pencil on the back. Margaret, 1912. I felt a cold shiver run through me. Who was she? And why did it feel like I knew her, like I had seen her before, somewhere in the house? Ellie wasn't sure what to make of it either when I showed her. We did some research on the house's history. It hadn't been lived in for decades, the previous owners having passed away under mysterious circumstances, and before that, the place had sat empty for years. The town had only a few sparse records about it, but as we dug further, a local historian told us of the house's darker past. A woman named Margaret, the last known resident, had vanished under strange circumstances. She was the wife of a wealthy man, a member of the town's prominent family, but she had been embroiled in a forbidden affair. It was said that her lover was someone close to her family, someone who had betrayed her in the most terrible way. Margaret had been murdered, her body hidden within the walls of the house, where it stayed undiscovered for years. The affair, the crime, had been swept under the rug, covered up in the name of family honor, and no one ever spoke of it again. But now I realized the house was speaking. The whispers, the calls for Margaret, they weren't just the echoes of the past. They were the voices of the dead, trapped in the walls, trying to communicate the horror of the crime that had been hidden for so long. The spirits of Margaret and her family, restless, vengeful, and angry, had been trapped in the house for decades. Their story never told, their suffering ignored. But the more I learned, the more the whispers began to change. At first, they had simply been calling for Margaret, for someone to remember. But now, they were growing more insistent. more furious. One night, I was alone in the house, trying to ignore the sounds, but then they began to speak louder, clearer, as if they were right beside me. Your bloodline! Your bloodline! I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I realized then, with growing horror, that the whispers were no longer just a plea from the past. They were calling out to us. The house had been built on the grave of Margaret's lover, the man who had murdered her. But the spirits, they weren't just angry with him. They were angry at the house, at the generations who had kept its secrets, who had allowed the truth to be buried. And as I sat there, the realization hit me hard. Ellie and I weren't just strangers in this house. We weren't just innocent victims caught up in the whispers of the past. We were tied to the very family that had been responsible for Margaret's death. Our bloodlines were connected, and the spirits believed that we were the descendants of the murderer, and they wanted justice. The next few days were a blur of terror. The whispers grew louder. The air grew colder. The house seemed to close in around us, suffocating us with its secrets. At night, I heard them calling for revenge. The spirits were angry. No, they were furious, and they believed we were the ones who needed to pay for the crime that had been committed so long ago. I tried to leave, but the house wouldn't let us go. It had us in its grip, pulling us deeper into its twisted history. The very walls seemed to pulse with the spirit's rage, closing in around us like a trap. They wouldn't let us leave until justice was served. In the end, I knew what I had to do. We couldn't escape the house, not without confronting the past. I gathered all the old records, the family portraits, the journal entries, and the letters we had found, and I went to the place where Margaret had been buried, deep within the walls of the house. I offered an apology to her, to the spirits that had been trapped here for so long. I spoke her name, and I spoke the truth that had been buried all those years ago. And when I finished, when the last words left my lips, the whispers ceased. The air grew still, and for the first time since we had moved in, the house felt quiet, peaceful. The spirits, finally at rest, faded into the ether. But I knew, deep down, that the house would always remember. It would always hold the ghosts of the past within its walls, waiting for the next soul to hear their whispers. Story 4. The Hidden Room. The house had always been a place of mystery for Emily and me, even before we moved in. It was an old family home, passed down through generations, a grand building that had seen better days. It creaked with the weight of history, and as we spent more time in it, we couldn't help but feel as though there were parts of the house that had been forgotten, tucked away, and never spoken of. But when we inherited it, we knew we had to take the plunge and renovate. The first days were spent cleaning out decades of dust and old furniture, revealing the beauty of the old place underneath. It had good bones, but the more we worked, the more I began to notice strange things, little details that didn't add up. Hidden panels, gaps in the floorboards, and one particular wall in the basement that didn't quite match the others. We were going to knock down that wall. I thought it might be a useful space for a small laundry room, and Emily, always practical, agreed. We had no idea that behind that seemingly normal wall was something far darker than we could ever have expected. As soon as the false wall came down, we found it, a hidden room, small and cramped, tucked into the shadows of the basement. The air inside was thick and musty, untouched by time, as though it had been sealed for decades. My heart skipped a beat. There, amidst the dust, were old family photographs, strange artifacts that I couldn't immediately identify, and an old, weathered trunk in the corner. It was locked, but that didn't stop us from opening it. Emily had always been the curious one, the one who had no fear of what lay beneath the surface. Inside the trunk, we found a stack of letters, yellowed with age and sealed with faded wax. It didn't take long for us to open them. The first few were innocuous enough, tales of family members long past, letters of old family gatherings, and mundane concerns. But then, as we read further, the tone changed. The letters became more urgent, filled with words like betrayal, secrets, and danger. Emily and I read each one with growing unease. We discovered that our ancestors had been involved in activities that, by today's standards, would be considered appalling, bribes, shady deals with criminals, and a web of deceit that had kept the family's reputation spotless while hiding unspeakable truths. But there was one letter, one particular note that stood out from all the others. It was a letter written by a distant relative, a name I vaguely recognized, but whose story had never been told in our family. The letter was addressed to no one, just a scribbled message written in a hurried hand. It spoke of a dark secret that had been hidden for generations, an unsolved murder, one that had been carefully covered up, buried so deep that no one in the family had ever suspected the truth. It was a murder that had torn apart a close relationship, leaving one family member broken and desperate for justice. But what really sent a chill down my spine was the revelation that this murder had been swept under the rug to protect the family from disgrace. Emily was the one who found the rest of the letters, the ones that explained the family's darkest deeds. They spoke of betrayal. Close friends turned enemies, relatives sold out to cover up the truth. But the most disturbing detail came in the form of one final letter, one written by the family member who had gone mad. According to the letter, the truth about the family's past had been too much for them to bear. In a fit of madness, they had begun uncovering secrets that no one should have known. They had discovered the real reason behind the murder, the identities of those responsible, and the lengths the family had gone to in order to protect their name. In the end, the relative had been locked away, hidden in the very basement we were now renovating, to keep them from revealing the family's sins. The final letter, sealed tightly in the trunk, was the most chilling of all. It was written in a shaky hand, and its contents were fragmented and incomprehensible, but it contained one crucial piece of information. The family member who had gone mad had been in the process of uncovering a truth even darker than the murder itself, a truth that was so horrifying it could drive anyone to insanity. The realization hit us like a wave. The same blood ran through our veins. The same family history that had led this ancestor to the brink of madness was now ours to bear. The letters had told us everything: the hidden room, the betrayal, the murder, and the family's lies. But the final letter, the one from the locked-away relative, warned us of something more. "Do not go further," the letter read. "If you uncover what I have, you will not be able to stop it. The darkness is in our blood. It will consume you as it consumed me." The weight of it was too much. We had only meant to renovate the house, to build a future in this place. But now, the past had risen up, and it was demanding our attention. The letters spoke of a darkness that had seeped into our bloodline, a darkness that had twisted the minds of those before us and threatened to do the same to us. Could we escape it? Could we ignore the truth, put the trunk back where we found it, and live out the rest of our lives in blissful ignorance? Or was there no going back from what we had uncovered? Emily, who had always been the one to push forward, to face things head-on, seemed shaken. Her hands trembled as she held the final letter, her gaze distant. "We have to know," she said quietly. "We have to understand what they went through, what they were hiding." But as I looked at the letters, the photographs, and the artifacts scattered across the room, I began to feel the pull of the same dark presence that had consumed our ancestors. The family's secrets were not just buried. They were alive, waiting to be uncovered. And the more we dug, the more I feared that the madness that had claimed one of our relatives was now claiming us, too. There was no turning back now. The house had claimed us, just as it had claimed those who came before. The walls, the hidden room, the trunk, it was all part of the same story, the same dark legacy. And as the days went on, I couldn't help but feel that we were descending down the same path, inch by inch, toward the same insanity that had consumed our ancestors. Emily and I weren't just renovating a house anymore. We were unraveling a story, a family curse that had followed us through generations. And now, the question remained: would we break the cycle, or would we be the next to disappear into the darkness of the hidden room? Story 5. The ghost of our past. The house had always been more than just bricks and mortar to me. It was a place filled with memories, some sweet and others not so much. I had left it years ago, moving to the city to chase dreams, to escape the weight of the past. But when the call came, telling me that my mother had passed away, I had no choice but to return. It wasn't the homecoming I had imagined. The house felt colder than before, haunted not by ghosts, but by something far deeper, something I couldn't yet name. My mother had always been the matriarch, the backbone of our family. Her death had left a hole, one I thought I could fill with time and distance. But when I arrived, something shifted. The house felt off, unsettling in a way I couldn't put into words. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of old memories. And at night, when I tried to sleep in the same room I had spent so many years growing up in, the dreams began. At first, they were nothing unusual. Fragments of memories, flashes of moments spent with my mother, her soft voice calling me from the kitchen, the rustle of her favorite chair as she sat by the fire. But then the dreams turned darker, more vivid. I began to see her face in ways I hadn't before. Twisted, contorted with pain, her eyes wide in terror, her mouth open as though to scream, but no sound came out. She would stare at me from the corners of rooms, from behind windows, and always, she would reach out to me, as though begging for something I couldn't understand. The dreams intensified each night, and with each passing one, I became more convinced that something wasn't right about her death. My mother had died unexpectedly. They said a heart attack, the kind of thing that happens to anyone, anytime, but I didn't believe it. My gut told me it wasn't natural. Something had happened, something dark that I couldn't yet understand. I began my investigation quietly at first, sifting through old papers, speaking to neighbors, to family friends who had known my mother longer than I had. But every lead seemed to hit a dead end. No one had any answers. No one seemed to want to talk about her death, as though it was a chapter best left closed. But I couldn't let it go. The dreams continued to haunt me, urging me forward, as if my mother's spirit was trying to tell me something, to reveal something that had been hidden for too long. As I dug deeper, I began to notice the patterns, the hints, the buried truths that no one had ever spoken aloud. My mother had always been careful, too careful about the people she kept close, about the things she said. She had always been the one to keep the family's secrets hidden, and I now realized that I had been blind to it all. But there were whispers in the house, fragments of conversations I overheard when I thought I was alone. I heard mention of a will, a dispute, an argument with someone in the family. The name that came up over and over again was Uncle Ray, my mother's younger brother. I remembered him vaguely, as a man with a temper, someone who had always been in and out of our lives, someone who had disappeared for years only to suddenly reappear when things were at their worst. But no one spoke of him after that. No one mentioned why he had been gone for so long. I began to wonder if his absence had been more than just a coincidence. One night, after hours of sifting through dusty boxes of old family records, I found it, an envelope old and yellowed, with my mother's handwriting on the front. It was addressed to no one in particular, just the words "for you" scrawled on the cover. Inside, I found a letter, and as I read it, my heart sank. It was a confession written by my mother herself, revealing that her death was no accident. The letter detailed a betrayal, a terrible crime that had been committed in our own family. It spoke of Uncle Ray, how he had murdered his wife years ago, driven by jealousy and greed. He had wanted the family fortune, the property, the power. But my mother had discovered his secret, and in the end, it had cost her her life. She had been planning to expose him, but before she could, he had killed her to silence her, making it look like an accident. Her death was a cover-up, a tragic consequence of a family's darkness that no one had ever dared to speak of. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized that I had been complicit in the cover-up all along. I had known something was wrong, but I had buried it deep, just like everyone else. I had chosen to live my life far from this place, far from the truth, because facing it meant confronting the horrors of my own bloodline. The dreams didn't stop, though. They grew even more intense, and now they weren't just visions of my mother's death. I began to see my own involvement in the crime. I saw myself, a child at the time, hearing my uncle's threats, witnessing the arguments, but doing nothing. I had been silent when I should have spoken up, silent when I could have stopped it. And now, my mother's ghost was haunting me, not just to expose the truth, but to make me face my own guilt. One night, the dream was different. My mother stood before me, her face now peaceful, her eyes no longer filled with terror. She spoke to me, but not with words. The message was clear. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want me to suffer. She just wanted me to understand the weight of what had happened, the weight of the family's sins, and the burden I now carried. In the morning, I went to find Uncle Ray. He was still alive, still living in the house on the outskirts of town, the same house where the murder had happened all those years ago. I knocked on the door, and when he opened it, I saw the guilt in his eyes, the fear that I would finally discover the truth. He hadn't thought I would come for him, not after all these years. "I know what you did," I said, my voice trembling, but I was determined. "I know about Mom. I know everything." He didn't try to deny it. He didn't even try to run. Instead, he broke down, admitting everything. The murder, the cover-up, the lies that had been passed down through generations. He was guilty, and I was guilty for not doing anything when I had the chance. My mother had died trying to protect us, and in doing so, she had saved me from becoming just another part of the family's dark history. As I left his house, the weight of the truth was too much to bear. My mother's ghost had finally found peace, and so had I. But the cost was high. The guilt that I had carried for so long would never go away. The family's secret was no longer buried, but I would forever be haunted by it. The ghost of our past would live on, not just in the house, but in me. As I sit in the quiet of my home, reflecting on the 5 stories I've read, a lingering weight presses on my chest. Each one, a tale of family secrets, whispers of the past, and the consequences that arise when dark histories are left buried. It's unsettling how, despite the passing of years, the truth seems to claw its way back to the surface, dragging with it the twisted remnants of betrayal, murder, and guilt. I had always heard people talk about the past catching up with you, but I never truly understood the depth of that statement until now. The first story, Whispers in the Walls, painted an image of a couple trapped in the horrifying echoes of a family's crimes, their bloodline tied to the violence of a distant past. The house they moved into wasn't just a home. It was a prison of forgotten sins, and the spirits of the dead had been waiting, not just to tell their story, but to seek revenge. The couple, innocent at first, found themselves ensnared by something far darker than they had anticipated, something that seemed to be their inevitable fate, tied to blood they never knew ran so deep. Then there was the hidden room, a chilling tale of a young couple's discovery of a locked-away family secret. The false wall in the basement wasn't just a barrier of stone and plaster. It was a boundary between the present and the terrifying truth of what had transpired in the generations before them. The room had held more than just photographs and old letters. It had been a tomb, sealing away the insanity and guilt of an ancestor who had stumbled upon a truth that shattered their world. What was worse than the hidden history was the realization that the past had been trying to repeat itself, and the couple's own sanity now hung in the balance. The ghost of our past brought a more personal horror. The protagonist's dreams became a haunting reflection of their own family's dark legacy, guilt, betrayal, and murder lurking just beneath the surface. Their mother, even in death, was still fighting to expose the truth. And as the protagonist uncovered the layers of deception, they began to understand the chilling reality of their involvement in the cover-up. In the end, it wasn't just the mother's death that had been a tragedy. It was the discovery that the protagonist's own hands were stained with complicity. They were just as much a part of the crime as the murderer who had committed it. Each of these stories shared a central theme: the family's dark legacy, the weight of buried secrets, and the inevitable consequences that followed. The ghosts that haunted the characters were not always literal. They were the whispers of truth long ignored, the guilt that festered and grew over time, and the inescapable shadow of the past. It became clear that no matter how tightly we try to close the doors on our histories, no matter how much time passes, those secrets will always find a way to slip through the cracks. I can't help but wonder, as I reflect on these stories, if the same truth applies to me. My family, too, has its own history, dark corners I've never dared to explore, secrets I've never wanted to know. I've lived my life, for the most part, unaware or perhaps intentionally blind to the truths that lie buried beneath the surface. But after reading these stories, I feel that weight, the uncomfortable stirring of suspicion that I, too, might one day uncover something that I am not prepared to face. The stories have left me with an eerie sense of foreboding, a sensation that my life is not as free from the shadow of the past as I once believed. What if my own family holds a similar history of betrayal and crime, one that is just waiting for the right moment to surface? What if the lies I've been told, the versions of events I've accepted without question, are all part of an elaborate cover-up? These thoughts linger in my mind, unsettling me with their implications. The idea that our ancestors' actions continue to shape our fates is more than just a theory. It's a harsh reality. The guilt, the sins, the decisions they made in their time echo through the generations, often in ways we can't even comprehend. We are not isolated beings, free to live our lives in peace. We are bound to the past, tethered to the choices made long before we were born. The psychological impact of this burden is profound. It seeps into our subconscious, influencing our decisions, our relationships, and the way we see the world. I think back to the families in the stories, the couple haunted by voices from the walls, the young pair uncovering the insanity that had been locked away, the protagonist trapped by their own guilt. And I realize that in many ways, these are not just fictional accounts. They are cautionary tales, warnings that the past does not remain silent forever. The truth, no matter how well hidden, has a way of resurfacing, and when it does, it brings with it the weight of the generations that came before us. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is the idea that no matter how much we try to escape our family's legacy, it will always find a way back to us. We may not be the ones who commit the sins, but we may be the ones who inherit them. We may not be the ones who suffer the consequences, but we will still bear the marks of what our ancestors did. And just like the characters in these stories, we may one day be forced to confront the dark secrets that lie beneath the surface of our own family histories. As I sit here now, reflecting on all that I have read and all that I have come to understand, I can't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. The ghosts of the past are always with us, whether we choose to acknowledge them or not. And while we may not be able to change the mistakes of those who came before us, we can at least choose how we face them when they inevitably return. The question is, will we be ready? Or will we, too, fall victim to the legacy of the dark secrets that our families have carried for generations? I close my eyes, and for a moment, I wonder if I, too, am being watched by the ghosts of my own past, whispers in the walls, waiting to be heard.